Well, another very warm welcome back, all my vintage dirt bike loving YouTubers, and thanks to you all once again for tuning in to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, coming up in my next two video postings, we're going to take a look at some of the lovely bikes in the Terry Pickering Classic Dirt Bike collection. Now, it's fair to say that Terry has quite a selection of very rare and beautiful bikes in his workshop, so we're going to take a look at some of Terry's examples in these next two videos. So in this first video we've picked out six race machines to let you take a look at, and we will showcase another six bikes in part two, so I do hope you enjoy these. Okay, enough chitty chat from me just now. Let's just jump straight into our first machine. Okay, first up we are going to take a look at Terry's 1980 PE 175 Suzuki. Now, Terry has a lot of restored and even brand new machines in his collection, although this little Suzuki is one of the bikes that Terry purchased a while back, and is more or less an original bike from 1980. Now, these PE or pure enduro bikes were built by Suzuki from about, I think it was 1977 to about 1984, and they had a range of engine sizes from 175 right up to the bigger 400s. Now, they were all powered by a single cylinder two-stroke reed valve motor, and these PE engines were just a variation of the RM motocross bikes of that same period. But these PE 175 engines were a decent size for enduro riding. They had a PEI ignition, or pointless electronic ignition. They had a 6-speed gearbox and a Mikuni VM32 carburetor, and Suzuki even supplied a small toolkit so that you could remove the rear wheel and change the spark plug whenever needed. Now, they also came, as you'd expect, with a full lighting kit and road registration to enable you to use the bike on the public highway. Although Terry did tell me that this is certainly no show bike, and this is one of the bikes that he uses regularly whenever there's a vintage enduro event taking place in his part of the country, but it's still a very fine example of one of these iconic PE Suzuki enduro machines. Okay, next up from Terry's collection we have this fully restored 1977 390 CR Huskvana. Now, this is actually a bike that was built by Terry's bike building friend Keith Ree. Now, originally this wasn't really a bike at all, but was made up using the huge stock of spare parts that Terry has lying around in boxes in his massive workshop. Now, the total rebuild project took Keith almost 3 months to complete, and almost all of the parts required to build this bike came from Terry's spare parts department, and other bits and pieces that Terry never had were then sourced from Husqvarna spares dealerships. Now, these 390 Husqvarna motors, as you know, are superb power plants with their reed valve fuel induction fed through a 38mm Mikuni carburetor. Now, these engines also had a 6-speed gearbox and a wet multi-plate clutch, which wasn't connected to the crank by a primary chain like the old Michaels of their day, but by a more sensible gear-driven system. Now, Terry does do the odd build or restoration on some of his collection, but if it's a bigger or major job, then he normally entrusts these kind of restorations to Keith, who has a very good reputation for quality when it comes to these older vintage racers. Although many of the parts used on this lovely Husqvarna are still original parts from that period, and they've also undergone a full refurbishment or renovation before then being fitted back onto the bike. So although the bike's not an original example from 1977, it's still made up from the correct 390 CR components from that particular year. So in that respect, despite its dubious pedigree, this is still another example of a 390 CR Huskvarna that's been resurrected from the ashes and then put back into service as another vintage twin shock racer. And for me personally, I think that Keith's done a fantastic job on this bike and added another iconic racing machine to Terry's ever-growing classic dirt bike collection. Okay, next up from Terry's Aladdin's Cave, we have this very rare 1979 Cotton EMX 250, which again is yet another bike made from Terry's mountainous collection of spare parts that swamp his warehouse. Now this EMX 250 is another fully rebuilt machine that's undergone the full treatment in the Terry Pickering workshop. Now these Cotton EMXs were the brainchild, of course, of Mike Etoff, who originally began by building frames for Alan Clues at CCM until he then started out on his own, and he initially called his brand new machine the Cotton EMCs, although sometime later he had to rename them to Cotton EMXs due to another company using the same EMC prefix. Now once again, these Cotton EMXs used the Austrian-made Rotax two-stroke motor, and apart from the bike's frame, swing arm and expansion chamber, all the other parts that EMX used to build these machines were sourced from outside manufacturers, mainly because this was a much better option rather than the company tooling up their own factory to manufacture their own components. Although these exhaust expansion chambers were made in-house by the EMX company, whereby they constructed these in a flat configuration and then expanded them using hydraulic pressure until they got the desired shape they needed to fit back onto the bike. Now the bike's front and rear wheels came from Italy. The front forks were Italian Marzocchis, and many of the other smaller items on this bike were basically straight off the shelf motocross components. Now the bike's plastic fuel tank and side panels were all made locally in Birmingham, so these were readily available whenever the EMX company needed more supplies. But this is another very nice classic that Terry's preserved for prosperity here, and in their day these were very quick and reliable and quite light machines, and the likes of Britain's Pete Mathia had a decent run of results campaigning one of these Cotton EMXs when he raced one for the factory back in the day. Now this next example from Terry's collection, I have to admit, is one of my favourite machines from his collection, and not just because this is a very rare bike, but because this is an Italian-made 1980 Ancelotti 250. Now this is not a restoration or a refurbished bike, but this is actually a brand new unsold bike from that particular year. Now this lovely bike is now heading towards 41 years old, and it looks like it's just come straight off the production line just 5 minutes ago. But this bike has never ever been started and has never even had a drop of fuel put in its tank since 1980. So if you want to take a look at a bit of history and just what one of these Italian Ancelottis would have looked like in 1980, then this is it. Now the bike is certainly a purebred Italian stallion with Italian front and rear suspension. It also has an Italian frame and swing arm, and is even powered by an Italian-made two-stroke Hyro motor. Now these Hyro 250 engines were used on a multitude of different motorcycles during the late 1970s and the early 80s, and even the famous Alan Clues used these power plants on his 1979 and 1980 CCM motorcycles. But they were very good engines and quite reliable, and this Ancelotti Hyro air-cooled motor was of course the last of the air-cooled engines before Hyro then switched to water cooling in 1981. And this bike of Terry's is certainly a time capsule from 1980, and I remember seeing this bike on display at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show in 2020, and Terry told me on that day that somebody had offered him £12,000 for this bike, and he turned it down. So that'll maybe give you an idea of just how rare this bike is that Terry decided to hold on to it. Although this particular bike is just one of the many rare machines that Terry has in his collection, and many of Terry's other examples are in a similar condition to this featured bike, so you can understand his attachment to this lovely motorcycle. Now, these polished alloy rear swing arms, or rear fork as the Italians like to call them, was how the bikes came from the factory. A lovely polished bit of alloy, probably just to add that little bit of Italian style and bling to this particular. Now, as you'd expect, Italian-made Corti-Cosa piggyback shocks as fitted for 1980. Now, these weren't the best that you could buy in that year, although they were just about good enough for using on flat tracks that had absolutely no bumps or jumps to contend with. But it's certainly a rare and beautiful machine without a doubt, and a brief look into what you might have seen in a motocross dealership window in 1980 if you lived in Central Europe at that time. So another iconic time capsule to add to Terry's ever-growing collection, and to be fair, I can understand why this bike's never been started, because I suppose if you were to do that, then some people might assume that the originality of the bike might then be taken away, and it would be then forever known as just another second-hand dirt bike. So once again, as another double treat, this is Terry's 1980 Fragario Puch 250 Scrambler. Now, once more, this is not another restoration or refurbished old race bike. This is yet another brand new, unsold and unused bike from 1980, and this example also has never been started or had fuel poured into its virgin tank. Now, the Fragario reference, as far as I'm aware, was the Italian importer of these Puch machines, and although they sold in decent numbers in Italy and the surrounding countries, they were not as well known here in the UK or even across the pond in the USA. Now, once again, these were powered by the hugely popular Austrian-built Rotax two-stroke engine, which were, as I said, used on many other race bikes of this era, including some SWMs and Can-Ams, to name just a few. But these had the rotary valve induction system that sucked its fuel directly into the crankcase by way of a rotating fibre disc on this left-hand side of the crankshaft, and this was hugely successful and reliable and a very efficient system. But once again, this was a very quick, light and reliable machine, and parts of the engine had magnesium casings to further reduce the overall weight of the bike. Now, the story goes that Terry bought this bike and a few others from a private collector in Belgium, who it's said also had a good assortment of old motocrossers in his collection from the 1980 that were either in brand new or in as good as new condition. And the word is that when the Japanese started flooding the market with cheaper and some would say better machines in the late 1970s and early 80s, dealerships in Europe were filling up with bikes that they couldn't sell, and this particular Belgium collector was then picking up many of these brand new machines at bargain prices. And so once again, Terry's added another little gem to his huge assortment of old 80s motocrossers, and this particular 1980 example of a Puch 250 is certainly a rare and tidy example of one of those Italian thoroughbreds. And if you want the full story on this lovely bike, then you can take a look at it in the latest issue, number 85 of the VMX magazine, where you can read all the lowdown on this very rare breed of bike. But this was an almost 800-mile round trip for me to get these video clips of this fantastic machine, but I have to say it was certainly worth it, because it's not every day you can look at a brand new 1980 Fragario Puch at 250. Okay, and finally for this part 1 of the Terry Pickering Classic Dirt Bike collection, we're going to check out his 1977 390 CR Huskvana. Now, as in some of Terry's previous machines, this is another bike that was made up from the spare parts department from Terry's workshop, and once again this is another lovely Husqvarna that was built by Terry's chief bike building friend and ex-Michael racer Keith Ree. Now, Keith is certainly Terry's go-to guy if he needs a restoration or a new bike built, if Terry doesn't have the time because of work or family commitments. He just then hands over all the boxes of parts, and then Keith does all the renovation and refurbishment of all the various bits and pieces before then rebuilding a bike. Although this is not an original machine, it's still a period correct example of one of these beautiful 390 CR Huskies, and I think that Keith can be justifiably proud that he's saved another one of these Swedish twin shockers from extinction. Now, as you'd expect, every single nut, bolt and washer on this bike has been painstakingly inspected, refurbished and then refitted to make up the finished machine, and you'd be quite hard pressed to see the difference between this parts bike and a full factory example. Now, as I mentioned, most of the parts that were needed to construct this bike came from Terry's spare bike parts department, and he still has a mountain of frames, engines, wheels and other bits and pieces of various other makes and models of bikes awaiting the Keith re-treatment. And if this is the kind of quality that the finished products are going to turn out like, then I just can't wait to see the rest of them, especially if they're as good as this old Husky. But with all the very hard work and renovation that's gone into building this parts bike, it's still a fantastic looking old motocrosser. Now, as you can see, period correct Magura clutch and brake levers with their associated covers, and there's also a nice Swedish made Gunnar Gasser throttle control fitted. Now, naturally this fuel tank was fully refurbished and then of course repainted and some brand new graphics added. Now, these Husqvarna wheels were relaced with brand new spokes onto those fully refurbished front and rear brake hubs. But once again, you have to say that Keith's made a fantastic job on this old Husqvarna, and it'll certainly add a bit of glamour to the rest of Terry's collection, which we're going to take a look at in part 2, so make sure you subscribe to my channel in order that you don't miss out on more of Terry's beautiful collection of motocrossers. Now, just as I mentioned, Terry has a good selection of projects awaiting build and restoration, and when you take a look at all these frames and wheels and engines that he has lying around, you'll certainly get an idea of the enormity of the task that lies ahead of him. because thankfully Terry's already rescued a lot of bikes from extinction, and for our sake let's all hope that that particular formula continues, because if these are the kind of bikes that Terry is producing, I for one can't wait for more. Well, I hope you enjoyed that first selection of machines from the Terry Pickering Classic dirt bike collection. It's quite fair to say that Terry has some beautiful machines in his particular workshop, and we'll of course be featuring another 6 selected bikes from Terry's workshop in my next video here on my channel. But until then, of course, please continue to browse and subscribe to my channel if you like what you see with regards to these old vintage race bikes, and that way, if you subscribe, you will be notified immediately every time I upload a brand new video. Okay, until then, continue to be safe and well, and we'll all get together once again to speak about more vintage iron right here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.